Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to another Tank Talk podcast. So happy you are here today. I'm here with John from KG Tropicals, and we've got a wonderful subject for you today. John, what are we doing today?
Today we're doing the best thing ever because it's one of those episodes where I just get to sit back and listen to the professor talk because we're talking about quarantining fish. Now, I'm somebody who believes in quarantining. I believe in it wholeheartedly. I think everybody should do it if they can. But I can't explain to you all of the scientific angles and the ins and the outs and all of the smart people stuff about it. But guess what? This guy that's sitting next to me here, this side, he can. So I'm excited. I've heard all of the things. I just tell people, hey, listen, just do it because you don't want your other fish to get sick. Just do it. But he can explain it to you in a much better way. So I'm excited to sit back and listen.
Well, yeah, and we are going to be talking about quarantine today. And understand, when we're talking about quarantine, a lot of what I'm going to share with you today comes from the background I have in doing my Master's Cert in Aquaculture and Fish Health. So I learned a lot of what we're about to talk about today from what I would consider to be true experts in the field. These were people who were managing large public aquariums. And so a lot of what they do is to make sure that when they have new fish coming into their system, they don't wind up with a multi-million-dollar mistake, right? So we want to follow some of those best principles when we are doing our quarantine. The stakes aren't as high, but they're still really important to us. Those stakes are still high enough where we want our fish to come in and we want them to be healthy. And there's a few things that we need to do. It's not rocket science. It really actually isn't all that complicated. And John, I've seen some of the stuff that you've done on quarantine. You explain it very well. And it's, again, if you do it properly, then you minimize the likelihood of having problems. In my opinion, the two things that cause the most pain in the aquarium hobby is not quarantining fish and not understanding the nitrogen cycle. And if you understand those two things, you eliminate probably 90 to 95% of the potential issues you're going to face when keeping fish. So, quarantine. I think the best thing to do is talk about why do we do it. We do quarantine because we don't know where the fish have been. Many times we don't know where the fish have been before they make it to our aquarium, and we just need to assume that they have the potential to carry disease. That disease can be internal parasites, it can be external parasites. And those diseases that those fish can carry might take a little while for them to establish themselves so that we can actually see the symptoms and signs that the fish have because of the parasite that they are carrying. So, all that being said, you get your fish. And people ask this all the time. How do I acclimate fish to my aquarium? And when they often ask that, they're asking how do they add the fish to their existing aquarium without doing any quarantine, going to the pet store, bringing them home, boom, right in the tank they go. And my response is always, well, you're putting them in a quarantine tank, right? And I know, here's what many of you are thinking. I don't have space for a quarantine tank. I can't get another tank. This doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. So, John, in terms of what you need, right, just the bare basics, if you're setting up a quarantine tank, what are you using in terms of just the bare minimum equipment that you want?
It would be a completely bare bones operation for me. It would be obviously depending on what kind of fish. If I'm going to bring in an Oscar that's 13 inches like this, then it wouldn't work. But for most of your small fish, I'm going to tell people just a 10-gallon aquarium, which you could buy at a garage sale for $1, or you can pick one up brand new at Petco for $10 when they do their sales 4 times a year or however often it is. I would have the cheapest light you've ever seen, if any light. If the room has enough ambient light, then I wouldn't even worry about a light. And I would make sure there's a heater and a filter. For me, I look at a quarantine tank as a tank that's not going to be set up permanently. So I would probably have a sponge filter in there, and just have it be wide open. I'm not worrying about decor. It's just a wide open tank with nothing in it but a sponge filter and a heater, just so that I can observe the fish. I'm not worried about it being pretty. I'm not worried about it having the best equipment in the world. just as absolutely cheap as it could possibly be.
And you have absolutely, that's perfect, right? That is absolutely perfect. That's the only things you need. Do some people put substrate in their quarantine tank? Sure, you can do that. In fact, in all of our quarantine tanks that we have some type of substrate in there, not because it's necessary. And in fact, there are some experts in the field that would say the substrate, not only is it not necessary, it could potentially be detrimental. I had a long conversation with the individual responsible for all of the health of the fish at APET, which is a major wholesaler of fish. And he made an argument, and a strong one, that if you have substrate in the aquarium and there are organic compounds in that tank, if and when you do have to medicate, you could have some cross reactivity. In other words, some of the meds that you would put in to an aquarium, which we'll get to later, that they're supposed to be targeting a parasite, may actually start binding to organic material in the substrate. So it's perfectly acceptable to go bare bottom as long as you're keeping the bottom of that tank mostly bare and not full of fecal matter and uneaten food. But if you have substrate, I personally have not found it to make a difference in terms of being able to treat fish effectively. You're right. Keep the filtration simple. You can use a hang on back filter if you want. The sponge filter is great. But the key there is the actual filtration in your quarantine tank. It needs to be cycled, because the last thing you want to do is put fish in a brand new tank that is not cycled with fresh, with no, media that is sterile. In the tank they go, and now guess what you have? You have an ammonia spike a week later, and so now your fish are having to basically deal with high ammonia, then later on high nitrite, the entire time they're supposed to be going through a quarantine process, and you're supposed to be making them healthy. You're destroying your fish. So really important. It's really easy to take that sponge filter, throw it in one of your regular tanks, your display tank, leave it in there. People ask all the time, how long does the filter need to be in there before I put it in a different tank for the beneficial bacteria to be in there? I like to go 4 weeks. So with your media, whether it's a sponge filter, whether you're just taking media out of the hang on back filter and putting it in a new smaller hang on back filter for your quarantine tank, leave it in there about 4 weeks. That'll get the beneficial bacteria in there. Typically, you're not stocking your quarantine tank very heavily, right? So you don't need a massive filtration system unless you've got larger fish in there, and then you need more filter media. The light you mentioned, you don't necessarily need a light if you've got a lot of light in the room. You do need to be able to see the fish, and you need to be able to see the fish enough so that you can notice external parasites. And I myself have run into problems with that from time to time, mostly because I never wear these things, but I do have them. I found now at the big 5-0, it's becoming more necessary. And when I'm
Me
observing
too.
my fish, I have now made it a point, especially when we're bringing in all these thousands of fish every 4 to 6 weeks, put these stupid things on, walk around the fish room, because you'll miss things, or I will miss things, as your eyes get maybe not as good as they were in your younger years. So there should be some light in there, light enough to be able to see uh, if there's any external parasites going on. You mentioned a heater. You definitely want to keep your fish at the proper temperature. If they are tropical fish, then yeah, you're going to want to run them 75 to 80 degrees, depending on the fish, for most types of fish. The other thing too, when it comes to quarantine, have a lid, because fish love to jump. Even fish you wouldn't think love to jump will jump. John, you guys have kept plenty of bettas, and I'm sure
Hmm.
you know that even bettas with those big flowing fins, they can exit themselves from a tank real quick.
They sure
So
can.
have a lid. You can put the tank on the floor if you really want to. I mean, it's not as easy to maintain, it's not as easy to visualize, but you don't, the point is, and John brought this up, you don't need to spend a lot of money, right? You just need to have a functioning aquarium that does. And by the way, don't make it look pretty, because what's going to happen, John? What's going to happen when you make a quarantine tank look pretty?
It's going to become a not quarantine tank. You're going to keep fish in it, and it's just going to be another tank in your collection.
And how many times have you heard people say that, right? When you're at an aquashella, or you're just talking to people, or they're leaving comments, yeah, I don't have a quarantine tank. I've turned my last 3 into aquariums, and now they've got 4 aquariums and no quarantine tanks. That can be an issue. The other thing you don't want to do, because it seems like a good idea at first, don't use a plastic tote as your quarantine tank unless it has the absolute best see-through plastic on the face of the earth. The black totes, the really opaque looking totes, they're not going to work, because you have
Right.
to be able to observe the fish thoroughly. That's not going to happen with most plastic totes unless they have really, really clear plastic. So be careful there. Okay. So that's the basics, right? That's what you need. Again, if you're keeping larger fish, like John said, you might need a larger quarantine tank. I would say almost, well, what do you think? 90, 95% of the fish that you keep would at least fit in a 40 breeder, right? I mean, you're not keeping these fish in a tank long term. So even a 10-inch Oscar, if you're just quarantining, you could probably get away with that for the quarantine period.
I mean, even a 20-gallon. I mean,
Yeah.
again, it is temporary. And if you think about when they were in the pet store, they were probably in a 20-gallon. So, yeah. But I mean, the only time that would ever become a problem is if you've got a 22-inch biker or something like that. You know, you're not going to want to torture them by putting them in a 20-gallon. But I mean, most fish that we keep in this hobby, probably even a 20-gallon would work.
Yep, absolutely. The other thing too is keep this in mind when it comes to the volume of your quarantine tank. Smaller is better here because if you have a problem where you have to treat that tank, increase temperatures, use medication, think about it. What would you rather medicate? 10 gallons of water or 40, right? When you're buying these medications, if you live in the United States or other parts of the world where it is legal to do so, they're expensive. And if you're using IC meds or antibiotics or antiprotozoals, and you're dumping those little packets in the 40-gallon breeders, you are going to be going through that stuff in a hurry, and it's not cheap. So you really do want the smallest quarantine tank that you can comfortably fit your fish in that you would typically purchase without abusing your fish or without causing them to get stressed out by having a space too small. You could add in caves and things like that, if the fish are normally going to be found in caves. But then again, you have to be careful because the number one thing you're trying to do in a quarantine tank is observation. You should be in the process of quarantine observing those fish 2 to 3 times a day. Ideally, you're feeding your fish in the morning, you're taking a real close look at those fish, making sure they're okay. You're doing the same thing in the evening. That's minimum, right? The last thing you want to do is quarantine fish, especially in that first week, and then forget about them. Like, oh, they're in my fish room in the basement, stuck in the corner somewhere. I go down there and feed every once in a while. I got somebody else feeding the fish a couple times. The last couple days, I'll get down there in 3 or 4 days. By 3 or 4 days, you could have lost them all and never know it. Or you could have such a horrible ick outbreak, it's too late at that point. So you really want to make sure you're observing those fish. Next thing, equipment, besides what we've already talked about, nets and hoses. Oh, story, I think, when we were discussing how to breed fish for profit or something like that. Again, we have, I think I'm looking over there. That's where the fish room is. I'm looking over to my right. I believe we now have 20 or 22 quarantine tanks for when we bring fish in. And about 6 or 8 weeks ago, we brought in some fish. One of the tanks had a bacterial infection. I didn't see it right away, probably because I wasn't wearing my reading glasses like I should have been. Eli went in, he started doing water changes. We used the same hose on blocks of tanks. Obviously, if there's something that is known to be sick, we don't do that, but he used that same hose in other tanks. Well, what happened was he spread that bacterial infection from the initial tank to another 20-gallon. And basically, the end result was by the time I noticed it and started treating it, we had lost a decent number of fish in one tank. And then my next question to him was, hey, Eli, where did you use that hose next? And he pointed to that tank. And sure enough, I look in there. Those fish now have the same thing. So it's really important. Whatever equipment you're using for your quarantine tank, nets and hoses need to stay with that tank. Do not use them in other tanks. Otherwise, you have completely defeated the whole point of quarantine. Right? If you're going to use the same hoses to do water changes or the same nets, then yeah, you might as well just throw them in your regular tank because you're already transferring this stuff everywhere. John, what other best practices do you typically use?
Well, this kind of goes back to the original setup I wanted to mention, but you were doing so good, I didn't want to interrupt you. Um, I've been asked before what is the best way, the best kind of a setup, and what I like to tell people is exactly what I told you: 10-gallon aquarium, heater, sponge filter, and if you're limited on space and you don't know what you're going to do between needing the quarantine tank, you take that sponge filter out of your quarantine tank, you put it back into your main tank where it's nice, and as long as you didn't have any kind of major outbreak or anything like that, obviously, if everything's clean, put it in there so that it stays seeded. The word seeded is what I've always used, so that it's ready to go. Empty out that tank, put your net, your siphon hose, your heater, your lid, all of the stuff that you use for that quarantine, put it inside the tank, put the tank underneath your other tank, and just leave it there. You're probably not going to do that with a 40 breeder, but with a 10-gallon tank, that's what I would tell people to do. And then it's there. You're not using the heater over here and the thing over there. And it's all here. You know exactly what you're going to do. And you know that even if you buy fish on impulse, you're still going to be able to quarantine them, because all you got to do is pull that tank out, pull some water out. You can even take it from your other tank and put it in your, so it's up to temperature, crank that filter on, heater, boom, you got your quarantine tank. Easy enough to pull it right out and use it. I don't know if that's what you were asking me, or if you were asking me.
That is fantastic advice. And yeah, I'm like you, I'm sure you get that. I get this question all the time. What do I do with my filter to keep it cycled after I'm done with quarantine? And just like you correctly pointed out, if your fish went through quarantine problem free, then if you're putting your fish in the new tank, your display tank, your filter's fine too. The media is fine as well. So again, the other thing that you can do if you're not using a sponge filter, which is even, I guess, probably going to make people feel more comfortable with not transferring things from quarantine to stock, to your display tank. If you're using a hang on back filter, then you don't need to transfer the media back, because you've always got more filter media in the hang on back filter that you can use next time as well. So if you're running a hang on back filter, just take some of the floss out, take some of the sponge out, put it in your hang on back filter. Ideally floss. Again, it's just got to be in there for about 4 weeks, and then you're just going to throw that away. And you've got more filter floss in the display tank anyway that you can use next time. So if you don't want to use a sponge filter, don't want to buy the air pump, or are a little bit concerned, like, man, I really feel uncomfortable putting that sponge filter back in there, you don't need to feel uncomfortable. But if you do, use floss from your hang on backs and just go that route with it. Now, the big question, the number one question I think we probably both get: how long? How long should we quarantine the fish? Now, I am going to give you my standards. And again, those standards are based on the experts in the field. When I did my master's cert in aquaculture and fish health, I was very blessed, because one of the instructors actually wrote the definitive book on fish health and fish disease. I think it's actually called Fish Disease. It's Ed Noga. He was actually an instructor for the fish disease class that we took. So these were, I went to University of Florida. I did their program. And these were people who were really, really, really in the industry. And I was very blessed that we had a ton of people in that program that were actually doing large public aquarium type stuff. So it was really cool. But what they said, and they made a good point, is 4 weeks is generally the accepted norm, minimum actually of 4 weeks. And the reason they said that is based on the experience that they had in both fresh and salt water. It can take up to 4 weeks for some diseases to show them, to present themselves, the signs and symptoms. And so I know, listen, I get it. You get those fish from the pet store. They're looking so amazing. And all you want to do is see how they look in your display tank. But understand, when you do that, you're taking a horrible risk, because often what happens is not only do you lose the fish you just bought, but you wind up losing a significant number of the fish you already had, right? So 4 weeks, that is usually, in that time, any external parasites are almost always going to become very evident at that point. What's not as obvious, at least initially, is internal parasites, right? They don't always show the signs from the outside. You know, you might have fish where they're not swollen, they're not skinny, they are eating initially. And if you watch the podcast that we did a couple weeks ago on the path that fish take from where they are born to your aquarium, we learned that the vast majority of fish are actually coming from overseas and outdoor breeding facilities. So through all of that process, these fish are getting a little bit stressed out. What happens is stressed out fish inevitably have immune systems that are compromised to a certain degree. So now you've got a stressed fish that has gone through many different types of water parameters. That in and of itself is stressful. The travel is stressful. And now they're in a new environment, also stressful. So now you've got them in the quarantine tank. You've got fish with an immune system that's undoubtedly been compromised going through that transition period in transportation. the last thing you want to do is throw that immunocompromised fish in your tank, because here's the other thing that can happen. And I don't think enough people talk about this. It is possible that your display tank has parasites in that tank that the other fish are mostly immune to, but they're still present. And then you put those new fish in your aquarium, they get sick. That allows an opportunity for all that those protozoans or bacteria to grow in a high enough concentration where now it has an impact on the fish that were already in there. And they were fine as long as the parasite concentration, the bacterial concentrations were relatively low. Their defense mechanisms were adequate until those parasites become high enough, the concentration is high enough where now they wind up getting infected and having a problem too. So 4 weeks, that is usually long enough so that almost all of your external parasites and most of your internal parasites will become obvious. I can tell you from my perspective, bringing in the volume of fish that we bring in every 6 to 8 weeks, it is absolutely critical. We have fish all the time that come in, and for the first week, they're eating, they're looking good, everything is great. And then something happens to them. Maybe it's like, oh, you know what? The water parameters that I'm in now, they're different enough. I'm starting to stress, or the stress itself is now actually starting to show itself, and now they've got some kind of a bacterial thing going on. Or now I'm noticing, hey, you know what? They were eating and now they're not. And now it takes me a little while to get them back on food again. So a lot of places will do less, right? We'll recommend, hey, 1 or 2 weeks is fine. I think anything certainly less than 2 weeks is almost pointless. You might as well just throw the fish right back, right in the display tank, with the exception of maybe ick. That's about the only thing you're going to rule out in less than 2 weeks. And even that can be hit or miss, but everything else, you're going to need a longer period of time.
This is why I was so excited to do mostly listening to this episode, because I've been keeping fish, Jason's, for 31 years. And I've never entertained the idea of there possibly being something already in your display tank that's being kept at bay, being held at bay, and your fish are tolerating it. But then the introduction of the new fish with a vulnerable immune system comes in and can't fight it. And then all of a sudden you have that is fascinating. That was never even something that occurred to me that could be an issue. Wow. It's not only your new fish bringing in something, it's something potentially, I'm sure this is rare, but something already in your tank that infects the new fish. Wow. I'm brain exploding right now. That's wild.
And think about it this way too. It's some of us have probably gone through the experience where we do quarantine fish. I had this happen in the 125 on the other side, where I had quarantined some geophagus and some severums separately. They made it through the quarantine process. I put them in the tank together, lost all of them except for 2 severums. I lost all the geos. So I had about 10 geophagus, lost them all, lost all but 2 severums. I actually still have one of them, and it's been floating around the fish room in different tanks. It's actually back in that original tank right now. It's thriving in there. But why did that happen? Most likely, somebody had something that looked fine in quarantine. I did the 4 weeks, but then the other group of fish were not exposed to that thing. They get it. They got it really bad, and now we have a problem throughout the entire tank. So again, if you quarantine for 4 weeks, do you eliminate the possibility of having disease in your tank? No, you can't 100% guarantee to be eliminated, but you can greatly reduce the likelihood that infection is going to happen in your display tank. And let's face it, if you have to move to treatment options, what's going to be easier to treat? A 10-gallon tank with pretty much all the same fish, bare bottom, there's nothing in there. Or how about we try treating like one of these tanks behind me, if you're watching on YouTube, that's heavily planted. Now there's invertebrates in there. And so now we're limited. You look at some of those meds, like not invertebrate safe, crud. Well, I can't get my 100 shrimp out of the 40 gallon, or in my case, the 125 gallon. I got a bunch of snails in there. All right, well, how am I going to find all of those? Oh, great. This medication is going to destroy all my plants. That's going to create a problem too. And some of these meds do damage to your cycle. So now you've got that problem, which is also the reason why quarantine is so important, because if you have to put meds in a display tank that is already heavily stocked and you damage your cycle, you've got a much bigger problem there, because now you're dealing with two issues. You're dealing with sick fish and bad water quality, which also, by the way, compromises the immune system, which causes sick fish, which causes you to have to medicate, which causes bad water quality. See where I'm going with this? It's that whole downward spiral. Do it right. Do it right the first time. Quarantine 4 weeks, and you can avoid a lot of these issues.
What that scenario you just laid out sounded like someone that's about to quit fish keeping.
That's how it happens, right? That's the
Yep.
one. Those are the comments you see on the videos where it's like, yeah, this fish keeping thing, I thought it was going to be simple, and I've had nothing but, fish die and all these horrible things, and I'm out. Here's my stuff. And by the way, once you sell your stuff on Facebook Marketplace, wherever you're selling it for, I always get a kick out of people like, I spent $300 on a setup. I'm selling it to you for $250. No, you're not. You know
Nope.
how you're actually going to sell it? For about $100 if you're lucky,
That's right.
because aquarium equipment devalues probably faster than just about any other hobby. I mean,
I think it does.
the minute you walk off, the minute you drive off the floor at that aquarium, it is now a 50 cents per gallon aquarium, unless it's like a really huge tank. But for the most part, listen, I mean, Petco's selling these tanks at $1 per gallon. People want a deal when they buy them on Facebook Marketplace. That means you're at about 50 cents a gallon. You throw in, well, I've got all this equipment. Yeah, okay, great. So you've got your hard water stained filters, and your lids are all crusty and nasty. And I got this heater with hard water stains near the top. And okay, yeah, you want me to pay for that? Because I would rather just get the new stuff because it looks nicer. So
You're doing that person a favor by getting it out of there. So you should just give me that tank, because I'm getting it out of your house and creating all that extra space for you. You should pay me to take that tank.
and some people do, right? I mean, that's why you used to see us so often. Like back in, I don't know if Craigslist is a thing anymore, but there would be people who would just kind of comb through Craigslist and wait for the post, 55 gallon on the curb, come get it, it's free. And
Yep.
people are racing over there, come get it. And so how are you going to charge money for something that a lot of people are just like, I don't need or want this thing. It needs to get out of my garage. Here, take it.
Yeah, used aquarium equipment. I mean, unless it's like Kessel lights that were only ran
Yeah.
for, a couple weeks or something, like you're not going to get what you expect to get out of it at all. So do everything you can to avoid that catastrophe from happening, and then you'll be good. And you know what? This is going back to what I was saying before. That setup that I talked about, where you're keeping that 10-gallon aquarium stored underneath the tank, can also easily be used in a scenario like that as a hospital tank. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to pull all your shrimp out and all that kind of stuff. But if you need to isolate a couple of fish to medicate only them, or to let them heal from injuries, you've got an automatic tank that you can set up for nothing, and it's always ready to go. So nothing to do with quarantining, but just another use for that
Oh, that
extra
is,
quarantine
I mean,
tank.
it's along the same thing. And that is, I remember one time I had an Oscar jump out of my 125, and it was heartbreaking. It was my albino Oscar. I loved that fish. I found it in time where it was still alive, but it was in really bad shape. But I wasn't going to throw it right back in the tank. And so I had a 10 gallon. Actually worked out perfectly because it was a small enough tank where it was in bad shape, where it wasn't upright. So with a 10 gallon, I was able to put it in a breeder box in a 10 gallon, at least get it upright. It wound up not making it. It lived for about a week, and it didn't make it. But the point is, like you said, if you've got something bad that happens, you got to fish with Popeye, right? Sometimes, depending on what caused it, maybe it was just an injury. You might want to remove that fish, give it the Epsom salt bath, do whatever, maybe treat it, but everything else is perfectly fine. Well, maybe it makes sense to remove that fish. And like you said, you've got that tank right there ready to go.
Yep. There for impulse buys of fish so you can quarantine them, or for the hospital tank. I'm really excited about telling my nightmare stories about quarantining. Are we there yet?
Yeah. Tell the story.
Well, I've got two, but one is heartbreaking and horrible and a great example of why you should always quarantine. The other one is a very funny story that I want to share with you and ask you if you've ever experienced anything like this. Obviously, if it's a funny story, it doesn't have anything to do with fish dying or anything like that. But a great example of not quarantining and regretting it. Lisa had, and she's talked about this publicly on YouTube, so this isn't something that was hidden from anybody. She bought a bunch, like 18 Ember Tetras from Rachel O'Leary. and they were ember tetras that Rachel bred. So they were special. Like, you get some fish from Rachel O'Leary, that's a big deal, you know. And she went to Rachel's house and bought these fish from her, and brought them home. She had them for like a year and a half, and they were great. And ember tetras are amazing. And when they've got Rachel O'Leary's name attached to them, that makes them even cooler. And she moved them into a 125 gallon, which is actually right there off camera, still running to this day, and decided, well, I got this space now, I should add some more to that tank. And we were, I guess we were like, we had taken a little break from the hobby in 2017 and then came back in 2018. And we didn't have a ton of tanks set up. We did not do the right thing. And having a quarantine tank set up or a spare tank that we could use as a quarantine tank was one of those things where it was just like, you know what? I ain't got time for all that. We bought, she bought these albino Cory cats, so adorable, from Petco. Or it might have been PetSmart, but I think it was Petco. And it's like, look at them. They're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with these fish. It's no big deal. It's fine. Well, there was something wrong with them. I don't know what, neither one of us know, you know, what it was that they had, but within like a week and a half, everything in that tank was dead, including the Cory cats. Yeah. And that was, it was not like she put those fish in there. They looked sickly. Things weren't right. Everything looked completely fine. She put those Cory cats in and everything still looked completely fine. Fish were eating. Everything was fine. There wasn't a problem in sight until there was a problem in sight, and the fish one by one started going out. And you didn't see them melt down and then all of a sudden do the death wobble and then they die. It was just, they're there 1 second, the next second they're dead. And it ended up wiping out the entire tank. We had no idea what it was, because by the time we would have ever had any opportunity to figure out what it was, everything was dead. Yep. So is that PetSmart's fault? Is that me telling you never buy fish from PetSmart? No, they're buying their fish from the same places everybody else does. But that was one of those scenarios. And that scenario could have easily happened from a mom and pop store too. We had, because we are retailers, we're able to buy fish wholesale, just like we are dry goods. And we bought, she bought, I think 24 rummy nose tetras for her discus tank. And we did not make that mistake again. We bought them from a wholesaler. I don't know how long they had been at our wholesaler. They could have come in that day for all we know. We bought 24 rummy nose. She put them in a 10-gallon tank as a quarantine tank. And Lisa and I, through our mistakes, we have developed the best possible thing that any fish keeper can have. I don't care if you've been doing this for 5 minutes or 50 years, and that's patience. And we're not in a hurry to do anything anymore. So she took those rummy nose tetras. She put them in a 10-gallon tank. This is not the funny story, by the way. Put them in that 10-gallon tank. They were small rummy nose. Like, they were the size of like neon tetras. Like, these were babies. They didn't last a week. They were all dead.
Yeah.
And this one was ick. It was almost immediate. Like, we got them in there. Everything looked great. Oh, they're so cute. But then within a day, it was too far gone. So wasn't she glad that she didn't put those rummy nose tetras with the discus? So yeah, those are our nightmare stories there. One of them was a true nightmare because we lost all of the other fish. The other one was a nightmare, but thankfully we did the right thing and we didn't lose any other fish. But then I have this funny story that I want to share with you. And you have way more tanks than I do. You show your tanks on YouTube all the time. So I would imagine this has probably happened to you, but I don't know. I got a tank that I'm looking at as we speak, but you can't see it on camera. It's my all blacked out yellow lab tank. It's my favorite tank that I own. Even more favorite than this one behind me. I love that tank. I love everything about it. I set that tank up in December of 2019, and I set it up with the sole purpose of putting nothing but yellow labs in there. Set it up, didn't have really, I had a little bit of black lava rock in there, but nothing substantial. got it running. It was running for, I don't know, 3, 4 weeks. And I got 60 yellow labs from our friend Rick Biro, who we're going to have on this podcast very soon. Um, there's nobody in this industry that I would trust more than Rick. I mean, when it comes to the world of African cichlids, I am 100% confident when I get something from him, it is good and ready to go. And I would be comfortable. I know you would be against this, and I don't blame you. I would be comfortable mixing them in with anything. But here's the thing. This was a brand new tank. This was a tank that had never had a fish in it. Mm-hmm. And I put those yellow labs in there. Jason, you don't know how many comments. They're still there. I didn't delete them because they're so funny. You don't know how many comments I got on that video. You're not going to quarantine those fish first? Now tell me why that's a funny story.
And you know what? I actually get that question a lot. And the reason why it's funny is when you first set up an aquarium, the first fish that go in the tank, that is your quarantine tank. You don't need to put them in a separate quarantine tank to put them in a tank that's never had fish in them before.
That's right.
So yes, we get that question a lot. Absolutely. When you have a brand new setup, you're not protecting anything that's in there, nor is there any opportunity for disease in the tank that go. The only exception is, okay, that was a huge volume. If you did have to do something medication-wise, it would have required a lot of meds in a 240 relative to a 29 gallon or maybe a 40 breeder to put those fish in. But other than that, there's no reason to set up a quarantine tank, to quarantine fish for 4 weeks, to put it in a tank that's been empty.
Well, and let me just add to that real quick. I'm sorry, I know you were going to go, but these were from Florida Exotic Fish Sales. Rick bagged them up at like 7 o'clock in the morning, put them on an airplane, all in one, or there was 4 bags. They all came from the same tank at his facility, bagged them all up, put them on an airplane. The airplane landed. We went to the airport, picked it up, brought them home. These fish were not out of the tank from Florida for more than like 10 hours. Yeah. And then we put them in here. So that whole, sure, that's a stressful thing for them, but the whole flying overseas and all of these different stops that they're making, that didn't exist. They were not even for 12 hours were these things in the bags. So there couldn't have been a more perfect scenario for ordering fish from somebody. They all came from the same tank. If there was a scenario where we were getting 5 peacocks from here, 5 from there, 12 mbunas from here, and 3 of these other fish from there, and we put them all into a brand new tank, then I could kind of understand you saying, hey, you don't know what you're mixing together there. Mm-hmm. But to get all the same fish, all from the same place, all from the same tank at that same place, the new tank is the quarantine tank.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah.
So,
and I've learned my lesson too with quarantine. There was a streak that we went through for probably 3 or 4 years where every single time we got fish from one of the swaps or one of the fish meetings from our fish clubs, we never had any issues. I would still quarantine them, and then I got lazy. And I went about 6 months where we would get new fish. I'm like, they're fine. They've been fine for years. They're coming directly from someone's tank. I don't need to worry. And sure enough, and it happened in a 125, and actually, I think it was the reason why I did the video on ick, because I had some black phantom tetras in there that wound up getting ick. But from what I can remember, they weren't the ones that brought the ick into the tank. I think it might have been the fish that I got from the swap or from the club meeting, and that brought it in, and now I've got this issue. And so people ask all the time, hey, they ask me this at the swaps. Well, I know you quarantine your fish for 4 weeks. Do I really need to quarantine these? And my answer is always yes. I did my job. You do yours for the exact reasons we've already pointed out, because you want to make sure that you've done your thing, that there's no additional issues, that they're acclimated to your water parameters, even though they're probably pretty similar. Just make it a habit of 4-week quarantine. The other thing I do want to mention is people ask all the time, should you medicate the fish in quarantine just as a standard rule? There are 2 philosophies to this, and I tend to go with the answer no. And when I talk to the experts in the field, they would say pretty much the same thing, unless you absolutely know that this is a fish that maybe it's wild caught, they're 99% of the time they're bringing in some type of external parasite. If that's the case, fine. But for the most part, I don't do that. And the reason I don't do that is, one, I don't think it's appreciated enough. Medications in and of themselves cause stress to biological systems. Your antibiotics, your antiprotozoals, that medication is going to cause stress to the fish. And what did we already talk about? The fish and their process. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about them going from, where they're bred all the way through all that export and import and wholesale and pet store. And now your tank, they're already stressed. Their immune system is already compromised. And so now what you're doing is you're taking that stressed fish with a compromised immune system in a quarantine tank, and now you're throwing a whole slew of meds at them that is going to further stress out the physiology and possibly their immune system for potentially no reason. And in some cases, if you had a healthy fish that was just stressed, you add in the meds, you wind up killing fish that would have been fine. Okay. The second thing is you're also going to be having some type of an impact on your biological filtration, on the microbes that are doing that nitrification process. And so now what you have is a potential for stressed fish in water that might have a slight ammonia or nitrite spike because you're adding meds that actually weren't necessary. Now, I do watch the fish very closely. That's why I'm observing them 2 to 3 times a day, because the minute I think that there is something that is not normal, and this is why it's so important to do your research, make sure you understand there's lots of YouTube videos out there, species profiles, pictures. You should know what a fish is supposed to look like. You should know what a fish is supposed to act like before you buy that fish, so that when you put them in quarantine, how are they swimming? Where are they swimming? Are they eating? How much are they eating? Are they aggressive? Are they passive? Are they hiding too much? You're not going to be an expert in the fish if you haven't kept them, but you have a general understanding of how the fish should behave. Once you see a variance from that, now you're starting to think, okay, oh, wow, you know what? This fish was fine, and now it looks agitated. It's constantly going to the top of the tank, or it's a cory cat and they're flashing. Flashing means kind of itching themselves on the rock. They're shooting up to the top a lot. They just look agitated. Or this is a fish that is normally going to be a pretty chilled out fish, but it just seems like it's kind of bouncing all over the tank periodically. We've had that before where we brought in fish and they're usually a relatively chilled out fish, and all of a sudden you just see them, they're darting around. You're like, that's not normal. Or, hey, these fish are super aggressive eaters. I'll give you an example. Rainbow fish. For those of you who've ever gotten rainbow fish when they're smaller, those fish should be going nuts, absolutely insane for food. They should be very aggressive eaters. Well, if you put food in the tank and they're just kind of like, nah, I'm good, that's not normal. That's not a normal thing. That might indicate, hey, I got to watch these a lot closer. And then maybe then, if you've got some reason, hey, maybe I will put in a combination of Expel P and Paracleanse for my internals. Or, wow, you know what? There's some white patchy stuff. It's definitely not ick. Do I go with the Maricin 1 and 2 combination? But understanding that when you do that, you could have an impact on your biological filtration. So I don't medicate from the start. The other issue is, because I teach microbiology, we have an entire unit on antimicrobials, antiseptics, disinfectants. And when we get to the antibiotics, we talk about antibiotic resistance, antiprotozoal resistance. And in that video I did with a pet, one of the things he mentioned was the fact that there is a lot more antiprotozoal and antibiotic resistance now than there was 15, 20 years ago when he was in the hobby working for wholesalers. And that's a scary thing, because once these medications are no longer useful, they're no longer useful across the board. So it's not just, oh, well, this fish had resistant microbes. Chances are there's more resistance out there than we realize.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask you that, because that's my number one reason for not medicating fish that are in quarantine, is because I don't want them to develop any kind of not resistance. What was I going to say? Well, I guess it is resistance. I mean, there was a different word I was going to use, but anyway, I don't want them to have that. I want the medications, if I do need them down the road, to be more effective. Immunity, that's the word I was going to use. Like, they become immune to the effects of antibiotics. I don't want that to happen. So I don't medicate unless there's a reason to.
And I think it's becoming more predominant. And for those of you who have medicated fish, think back to the meds you used and did they work? I'll give you an example. General Cure. I don't think that med works. It to me, it's almost useless at this point. It doesn't do nearly as much as it did even 10 or 15 years ago. Erythromycin, the antibiotic, doesn't work nearly as it good years ago. Even the ick meds, yes, the ick meds, the malachite green based ick meds, the methylene blue based ick meds, even the stuff with the formalin, it doesn't work as efficiently as it used to. And again, when I was talking with the experts in the field who deal with hundreds of thousands, millions of fish, they're seeing the same thing. The dosing that they're having to use is higher. They're losing a lot more fish because the dosage is higher, and that's stressing out the fish. Because remember what I said, all of these meds stress out the fish, and in high enough concentrations, they all become lethal. In microbiology, we talk about two things when it comes to antibiotics. We talk about uh, selective toxicity, which is basically a term that we use to describe how well does the medication target the parasite or the pathogen relative to the host. That's important. We want the medication to be highly selectively toxic. Target the pathogen, leave host alone. When we take antibiotics, that's what we want. We want to feel okay. We don't want to be in trouble and feel sick from the antibiotic. We want it to kill the microbe. The other concept is something called therapeutic index. It's a mathematical statement as to how selectively toxic a medication is. Well, if that selective toxicity is starting to narrow, the therapeutic index is starting to narrow, and now there isn't as much of a difference between what do I need to kill the parasite relative to what is going to be toxic to the actual host, the fish, or in the case of antibiotics for people, the person. And the closer that is, the more side effects you have, the more likely you are to lose the fish when trying to treat them. So, I don't treat unless I need to.
Let me throw a curveball at you here a little bit. And if, for those that are watching on YouTube, you may notice a little change on me here. I just had to remove my headphones because Jason and I have been recording for 4.5 hours, and they died. The batteries died in my AirPods, so I'm having to unmute and mute. Anyway, that's what's going on there. But we talked a couple of weeks ago about the path of fish from the farm uh, to your aquarium. And one of the things that we didn't really touch on at all, I think, is there's a very good chance that your fish that you just bought from your pet store has not eaten since they were at the fish farm, because distributors, they ain't got time to be feeding fish and rarely do. Some of them may, I don't know, but a lot of distributors, the fish come in and they go out so fast, they don't even end up feeding the fish. And even, believe it or not, I know people are going to struggle to believe this, a lot of fish stores don't even feed their fish, or if they do, it's very, very rare that they do. So how alarmed are you? I'm not asking you about like sunken belly, where it's like anybody that buys a fish that's belly is just completely caved in. I mean, I hope you got a discount, but what about a fish that's a little thinner than you think it probably should be? Are you going to panic over that and be like, oh my God, this fish is sick? Or could that be that it's just because the fish has not been fed the way they normally would, and they just need to plump up a little bit?
That's an outstanding question, and it is absolutely true. I know from the wholesalers by us, because my older son works for one of them, they do feed the fish. I think pretty much every day. Most of our pet stores around here, they do as well, but they're still going to be mostly underfed. And there's a lot of food competition in those tanks because they are stocked so heavily. It's not uncommon to see 150, 200 fish in a 29-ish gallon size tank. So it's very common. It's industry standard for the most part. But if they look a little undersized, I'm not worried. A sunken belly, that's a different story. I'm not buying those fish. The minute I see them in a larger group, I'm probably removing those fish. That would be an indication, yeah, I need to probably jump on this right away with my Paracleanse and Expel P combination. I like that in combination because, again, metronidazole by itself is marginal. Levamisole is pretty good, but I like the combination of both of those, hitting them from two different angles. I think it actually reduces the likelihood that the microbes and the parasites will become resistant to any one of those medications. So, yeah, I'm not overly concerned there. The other thing that we have to consider, and I don't think we talk about it enough, just because a fish has a parasite doesn't necessarily mean it's sick. And that is something that not enough people think about or talk about in the hobby. Because if you go into nature, a lot of these fish are going to have something that is taking food from them, taking nutrients. I'm not talking about ick or the externals where it's like, yeah, if I don't treat this, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. But mostly for the internals, I think we would be surprised when we open up a lot of fish and we actually did some more investigation, how many fish wind up with some type of parasite that they've been carrying their entire life. And the life expectancy of that fish didn't really go down, and it didn't really have a significant impact on their overall quality of life throughout their life. So I'm not saying that we should just let parasites run wild, right? And we are in a closed system. So I understand that as well, that we are in a glass box. It is a closed system. And so parasites are much more likely to transfer from one fish to another. But at the same time, I don't know if it's realistic to expect that all of our fish are always going to be 100% free of some type of parasite. I just don't know how realistic that is. And so I take that into consideration as well when we're treating fish. If they've got signs and symptoms of disease that is impacting quality of life, and it's clear to me, they're going to get the meds. Outside of that, I let them roll, and that's just the way we've always done it for, I don't know, I've been fish keeping now for 44 years. And I mean, the meds haven't been out there quite that long, but yeah, I'm not treating unless I need to.
Well, this may be another one of those topics that's already on our list. And in fact, I'd be surprised if it's not. But all of this talk about Paracleanse and Prosicleanse and metronidazole and XBLP and all these might be a good episode. I mean, of course, we just talked about all Fritz products, not metronidazole, but maybe an episode all about what each individual medications do. And both of us, we are on the Fritz team, so we could use them as an example. But, CChem also makes great medications, and say what you will about API. But to me, it's Fritz and CChem that are like the leaders of fish medications. We should do a whole episode on what each individual one does. And this is another one of those things that I know it, but I might not be the best at explaining it. So it'd be another really good episode for you to take the lead on, because that's your
and
thing.
The even more interesting thing would be, let's get Fritz in here. Let's get some of their heavy hitters, the PhDs, because they're going to know more than I do. I'll know the questions to ask them, so we can get really deep into the weeds here with some of this stuff. And I think it would be really cool if we could get some of the industry, the true experts, right? I'm not an expert. I have an educational background on some of this stuff, but I'm not in it every single day the way that someone would be at a Fritz, or some of these places that are developing these medications and have got the studies at their fingertips and are really, they've got their pulse on this. And I think that would be a really cool thing to do.
You and I, we know all of the sales reps from Fritz. I could name them all to you right now for the entire world. These are all good friends of ours, people that we work with all the time. But I don't know those guys or girls.
They know those guys. And so as long as we know the guys we know, and they know the guys we need to know, we'll get to know the guys that we need to know that they know that we don't know yet.
That's very true. Because what I wouldn't want to do, all due respect to Sean and Evie and Jacob and everybody there, I don't want a salesperson to do what you just said. I want the guy. Yeah. I want the one that's wearing the pocket protector and the lab coat and has the glasses. And that's the one that I want. The man, woman, whatever it is. I don't even know who they are at Fritz, but that's a good get. That'd be a good idea.
Yeah. So we'll work on that. So for everybody here, that's what John and I are going to work on. I don't know when it's going to happen. We'll have some conversations probably when we go to Aquashella. We'll try to get that to you. And that was one of the things that John and I had talked about when we did the Tank Talk podcast, is you're going to see it more. This is not always going to be just John and I talking about stuff. You've got a whole bunch of people planned when we go to Aquashella, some people in the industry that have knowledge in areas that we will never have, and they've forgotten more than we will ever know. And I've got some contacts too in various clubs, industry contacts, so we can really get into the weeds. So for those of you who are like, you know what, some of the subjects we've covered so far, yeah, it gave me a little bit to think about, but I really, really, really want to get deep into the details. It's coming. It will be coming. We got it. We're going to get those people here. It's going to be free to you, and just stay tuned because we will. That's our job. That's what we're working on.
Yeah, Dallas will be, we've got Rick already lined up, and that would be the ideal time to get somebody from Fritz, perhaps. We know the people that we can call to see if we can make that happen, because they're based out of Dallas. So we'll be right there. So that, if we were able to make something like that happen, that'd be perfect. You've got all your contacts in the Chicago area for when we're doing Chicago Aquashella, and I'm sitting in the same room you are right now. That's going to be so exciting to be able to do that. So yeah, we've got so many things planned for the podcast, and the door's open. If you know somebody and you're listening to this or watching this that you think we should have an industry expert, don't tell us you should have this other YouTuber. And I don't know, we're not talking about that. All due respect to those people. We're saying those people that you maybe wouldn't normally hear of. A great example of somebody that we had back in the summer, Diana Wallstead. You don't normally see her on YouTube. Guests like that for this podcast would be absolutely amazing. If there's somebody that that we don't know, that we know, we should, we know. I just tried to do what you did and I failed at it horribly, but
it was a good try.
Somebody that that we should have on, let us know, and we'll definitely take that into consideration, whether we have to do it remotely or at Jason's place or in Dallas or wherever, Daytona. We'll make that happen.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think we did a pretty good overview of quarantine. The takeaways here: 4 weeks. Don't cheat yourself. Don't cheat your fish. Don't cheat your display tank. Medicate. If you see something, keep it cheap. Keep it a tank that is relatively undesirable. Keep your filter media cycled and ready to go for when you get that. You go to the pet store, you do that accidental impulse buy. It's a really simple setup, and you're going to have a lot more success, because the last thing you want is disease in your display tank, because it becomes problematic with volume, with other inhabitants, with plants, with your filtration, your cycle, and you want to try to avoid that as much as you can.
And if all of this sounds like a problem to you, if you're listening to this like, I ain't got time for all that nonsense, keeping these fish in a separate tank for 4 weeks and all that, I ain't got time for all that, then what you need to work on is the number one fundamental thing in this hobby, which is patience. Stop being in such a hurry all the time to get everything done right now. Sit back, relax, and just do things the right way. And don't be in such a hurry. You'll enjoy this hobby a whole lot more.
Absolutely. And if you don't have the patience there, trust me, you're going to need it when you're treating the tank, spending 10 times more money with the meds and losing not only the fish that you just brought in and your existing fish. It can turn into a real nightmare, and it's very undesirable.
Very true.
But anyway, I think
go right for it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. We are going to have all kinds of cool stuff coming up in the not too distant future, because by this point we're getting really close to the Aquashellas. We're going to have some awesome guests for you. Thank you for being here. We'll be back same time, same place next week, and I hope you have a great week.